June 15, 1910, Cardiff, Wales. A steam-powered ship eases away from the dock as ropes are released and the crowd slowly steps back from the water. There is no alarm, no sense of danger. Men wave hats, families lean forward. Newspapers will describe the moment as calm, confident, proper. The ship's name, Terra Nova, is painted clearly along the hull. On board are naval officers, scientists, sailors, and specialists, men who believe they are prepared, men who believe they understand what awaits them. What no one along the harbor realizes is that the outcome of this expedition will not be decided by storms or ice. It will be decided by choices already made, choices rooted in tradition, expectation, and a particular idea of what exploration is supposed to look like. This is not the story of how the Terra Nova expedition ended. This is the story of why it began. By the beginning of the 20th century, the age of discovery was coming to an end. The world's coastlines had been mapped, continents crossed, rivers charted from source to mouth. Exploration, once driven by survival and necessity, had become symbolic. It was no longer about finding land, it was about claiming meaning. And in this shrinking world, Antarctica remained the last great blank space, an entire continent, unexplored, unmapped, and hostile to human life. It offered nothing of practical value. No trade routes, no resources, no settlements, but it offered something else, a final test. The South Pole was not a place anyone needed to reach. It was an abstract point, invisible, frozen, and irrelevant to navigation. But by 1900, it had become a fixation. Reaching it meant being last, the last to arrive at a place no one had stood before. For nations, this mattered. For empires built on reputation and influence, it mattered even more. And no empire felt that pressure more acutely than Britain. For over a century, British explorers had defined the limits of the known world. The Royal Navy had mapped oceans and coastlines across the globe. British expeditions had shaped geography itself. But by the early 1900s, that dominance was slipping. Other nations were moving faster, using different methods, challenging British assumptions about endurance and discipline. Norway, in particular, was emerging as a polar power. Norwegian explorers treated cold environments not as moral trials, but as technical problems. They skied, they used dogs efficiently, they adapted their methods to the ice. To British institutions, this approach felt unsettling. Exploration, as Britain understood it, was about character, about order, about perseverance. Antarctica became the place where those values would either be proven or exposed as outdated. Robert Falcon Scott was a product of that tradition, a naval officer shaped by hierarchy, procedure, and discipline. He was not a natural innovator, but he was respected, and he had already been to Antarctica. Scott had led the Discovery expedition from 1901 to 1904. It had not reached the pole. It had struggled with logistics. Man-hauling had exhausted the men. Dogs had been mishandled. Progress had been slow. Yet Scott returned to Britain as a public figure, not because he had succeeded fully, but because he had endured. That mattered. In lectures and writings, Scott framed Antarctica as a proving ground, a place where suffering revealed character. That philosophy would shape everything that followed. In 1909, Ernest Shackleton returned from the South with extraordinary news. He had come within 97 miles of the South Pole, closer than anyone in history. The pole was no longer theoretical. It was within reach, and that changed everything. If Shackleton could come that close, someone could finish the journey. Scott understood immediately what this meant. If Britain did not act quickly, the pole would be claimed by someone else, and whoever claimed it would define the narrative of Antarctic exploration. Scott did not announce his plans immediately, but within months, preparations began. This would not be another broad exploratory mission. This time, the objective was clear: the South Pole. Everything else would support that goal. Officially, the expedition would be scientific, geology, meteorology, biology, but everyone involved understood the truth. Science justified the expedition. The pole justified the risk. Funding the expedition was not simple. Unlike earlier missions backed directly by the government, Terra Nova relied heavily on public and private support. Committees were formed, donations requested, sponsors approached. With funding came expectation. This expedition would not belong solely to Scott, it belonged to Britain. Failure would be public, and that pressure shaped every decision. Scott could not abandon tradition entirely. Innovation would be allowed, but cautiously. The most critical question was transport. How would men and supplies move hundreds of miles across ice? Scott chose a compromise. Motor sledges would represent modern technology. Ponies would haul heavy loads across the Ross ice shelf. Dogs would assist where possible. Man-hauling would remain central. This approach satisfied committees. It respected tradition, but it created complexity. Each system required different skills and timing. Failure in one would affect the others, and Antarctica punishes complexity. The ship Terra Nova was acquired, strong, proven, but aging. The crew was assembled from varied backgrounds: naval officers, scientists, experienced sailors, men with no polar experience at all. Training was limited. There would be little chance to adapt once the ice closed in. On June 15, 1910, the Terra Nova left Cardiff. From the beginning, the voyage tested the expedition. Storms battered the ship. Cargo shifted. Fuel was lost at sea. None of this was fatal, but it was cumulative, and Antarctica does not forgive accumulation. In January 2011, Antarctica appeared on the horizon, a white wall emerging from fog. Scott chose Cape Evans as the base site, familiar, defensible. Huts were built, supplies unloaded, animals brought ashore, but the environment asserted itself immediately. Ponies suffered, machinery faltered, cold penetrated everything. The expedition had arrived, but it had not yet been tested. Before any attempt on the pole, supply depots had to be placed. These would determine survival on the return. Teams set out south, hauling heavy loads across unstable ice. Progress was slower than planned. Depots were placed closer together, markers were minimal, energy reserves were strained, but the men returned, alive, which often masked deeper problems. As the sun dipped below the horizon, winter settled over Cape Evans. Darkness became constant. Inside the hut, routines formed. Scientific work continued. Lectures were given, meals shared. Scott refined his plans. He had not yet finalized the polar party. He had not committed fully to one transport method. These decisions were postponed. Outside, the ice waited. By the time the sun returned, the expedition stood at a crossroads. The world expected success. The plans were in motion. The ice had not yet demanded payment. Everything still seemed possible, and that illusion would soon disappear. In late August of 1911, the sun returned to the Antarctic sky. Not suddenly, not dramatically. At first, it appeared as a thin arc of light along the horizon, weak, distant, and deceptive. But its return signaled something important. Winter was loosening its grip, and the expedition could no longer delay its most critical phase. Every plan Scott had refined during months of darkness would now be tested against reality. There would be no revisions once the sledges moved south. As daylight increased, activity around Cape Evans intensified. Supplies were reorganized, rations measured and remeasured, clothing inspected for wear. Nothing was casual. Every pound mattered. Every ounce had to justify its presence. Scott reviewed meteorological data. He studied previous expedition journals. He recalculated distances repeatedly. But preparation was no longer theoretical. The expedition had reached the moment where intention became action. The motor sledges were the first to move. They were meant to lead the advance south, hauling heavy loads quickly and efficiently. Within days, the illusion collapsed. Engines froze, tracks slipped, mechanical failures multiplied. One by one, the machines were abandoned. Their cargo was transferred to human shoulders. The loss was not dramatic, it was quiet and irreversible. The ponies followed next. They had been expected to carry the bulk of supplies across the Ross ice shelf, but Antarctica did not tolerate them. Soft snow swallowed their hoofs. Cold weakened them. Ice cut their legs. Progress slowed. Ponies fell, and when they could no longer stand, they were shot. Their meat was cached as food, a grim acknowledgement that the plan was already unraveling. The dogs remained the most reliable form of transport, but Scott never fully trusted them. Handlers lacked experience. Deployment was cautious. Rather than leading the advance, dogs were used sparingly, often to support human hauling rather than replace it. This decision would echo through the journey. By early November 1911, the expedition moved decisively south. Teams departed in staggered formations. Each had a role. Some would carry supplies forward and return. Others would continue farther. The system relied on precision. Every mile south was paid for in energy. At first, conditions seemed manageable. The Ross ice shelf stretched flat and white before them, but even here inefficiencies became visible. Men burned calories faster than expected. Loads felt heavier each day. Rest brought diminishing returns. No single mistake defined these early weeks. Instead, it was accumulation. Depots were laid slightly shorter than planned. Markers were fewer than ideal. Fuel measurements were conservative. None of these decisions seemed dangerous in isolation. Together, they narrowed the margin of survival. As distance increased, support teams began to peel away. Each departure reduced manpower. Each departure increased strain on those who remained. Scott adjusted the plan as he went. Rations were redistributed, loads recalculated. Flexibility became necessity, but flexibility in Antarctica is often just delayed commitment. Scott had initially planned for a 4-man polar party, but as the journey progressed, uncertainty crept in. Weather patterns were unpredictable, fatigue was mounting, transport had already failed in part. At the last moment, Scott made a critical decision. 5 men would go to the pole, not 4. The decision was made quickly, its consequences were permanent. Food and fuel had been calculated for 4. Now everything would be divided one more way. The men accepted the order without protest. There was no space for debate. The Beardmore Glacier marked a clear transition. The flat ice shelf ended. In its place rose a fractured, shifting landscape of crevasses and icefalls. Progress slowed dramatically. Sledges had to be hauled upward, inch by inch. Man-hauling became brutal. Men leaned into harnesses for hours at a time. Sweat froze on their clothing, hands numbed despite constant movement. Here, the weaknesses of earlier decisions became undeniable. Dogs could have moved loads faster, skis could have conserved energy. Instead, endurance was demanded, and endurance has limits. Injuries appeared gradually. Frostbite nipped at fingers and toes, blisters split open, muscles stiffened and weakened. The men pressed on. Rest days were rare. There was always pressure to move. Time, Scott knew, was slipping away. Beyond the glacier lay the polar plateau, a vast featureless expanse. No landmarks, no shelter, just distance. The air thinned, temperatures dropped further. The 5 men moved like figures in a blank world. Every calculation now mattered. Fuel determined warmth. Food determined survival. They could not afford delay. And yet, fatigue clouded judgment. On January 17, 1912, the men reached the South Pole. There was no celebration, no triumph, only silence. Ahead stood a tent, a black flag, proof that they were not first. Roald Amundsen had arrived weeks earlier. Scott noted the moment in his journal with restraint, but the impact was devastating. They had endured the ice, they had lost the race, there was no time to linger. The pole offered nothing, no shelter, no supplies, only the knowledge that the return journey would now define survival. They turned north, heavier than before. Scott insisted on carrying geological samples collected along the route. Even here, science remained a priority, perhaps too much so. As days passed, strength faded rapidly. The psychological weight was immense. The goal was gone. Only distance remained. Sleep offered little recovery. Food no longer restored strength. Each man began to decline at a different rate. Edgar Evans deteriorated first. His coordination failed. He stumbled. He lagged behind. The others slowed to support him, but energy reserves were falling dangerously low. On February 17th, near the base of the Beardmore Glacier, Evans collapsed. He did not rise again. They buried him in the ice and moved on. There was no alternative. Now 4, then 3. Each loss changed the dynamic. Rations were adjusted again. The men pressed north. The distance to safety shrank, but so did their strength. Weather worsened. Blizzards became frequent. Progress slowed to a crawl. Captain Lawrence Oates suffered terribly. His feet were ruined by frostbite. Walking became agony. He knew what he cost the group. He knew the mathematics. On March 16th, during a storm-bound halt, Oates made his decision. He rose from the tent and walked into the blizzard. "I am just going outside and maybe some time." He did not return. Scott, Edward Wilson, and Henry Bowers continued alone, weaker, slower. Depot 1 Ton lay ahead, with food, with fuel, with survival. But Antarctica had one final demand. Blizzards pinned them down, day after day. 11 miles remained, close enough to imagine survival, far enough to be unreachable. They waited, they conserved energy, they wrote. Outside, the storm did not lift. The expedition had crossed the continent, but Antarctica had not finished with them. The ice did not need to hurry, it only needed patience. The storm did not end suddenly. It weakened in stages, long pauses between gusts, brief moments where the wind seemed to hesitate. But the tent remained closed. Inside, Scott, Wilson, and Bowers waited. They no longer discussed plans, there were none left. Fuel was nearly gone. Food had been reduced to fragments. Movement had become impossible. The distance to the depot remained unchanged, 11 miles, close enough to measure, far enough to matter. They marked the passing days by sound, by the wind, by the shifting snow against the canvas. Time slowed, and then it stopped. Scott continued to write, not continuously, only when strength allowed. He recorded the cold, the exhaustion, the certainty that rescue would not arrive. He wrote letters to families, to friends, to those who would eventually read his words. There was no bitterness, no accusation, only explanation. He described the conditions plainly, as if still reporting to a superior officer. The last entry was dated March 29, 1912. After that, the journal ended. At some point, the effort to conserve energy gave way to stillness. Sleeping bags remained closed, equipment lay untouched. Outside, snow continued to accumulate. The tent slowly disappeared into the landscape. No sound marked the moment when life ended. Antarctica does not record such things. Back at Cape Evans, months passed without news. The men who had remained behind followed routine. Scientific work continued. Observations were recorded. Supplies were maintained. But as weeks turned to months, concern grew. The expected return never came. The ice closed in again, and another winter followed. In October 1912, with the return of light, a search party set out. They followed the route north from the interior. There was no optimism, only obligation. They moved carefully. The ice had shifted. Markers were partially buried. Tracks had long vanished. Then, on November 12th, they found the tent, collapsed, half buried. They knew before they opened it. Inside were the three men, still in their sleeping bags, still arranged deliberately. Beside them lay the journals, the letters, the geological samples Scott had refused to abandon. The search party read in silence. Nothing needed to be said. They closed the tent and built a cairn over it. There would be no recovery. There was no way to bring them home. Above the cairn, they placed a simple wooden cross. On it, they carved words chosen not for explanation, but for resolve. Then they left. The wind erased their tracks within hours. When the expedition finally departed Antarctica, it did so quietly. There were no celebrations, no announcements, only absence. The men returned north carrying journals, reports, and the knowledge that the mission had ended far from where it was meant to. When news of Scott's death reached Britain, it arrived slowly, and when it did, the reaction was immediate: shock, grief, admiration. The story was told first as one of courage, of endurance, of men who had gone as far as they could and no farther. Details emerged gradually: the distance to the depot, the weather delays, the final days. But the sequence of events was clear. They had not vanished, they had been overtaken. Nothing could be changed. The decisions had already been made. The ice had already answered. There was no single moment where the outcome turned, only a chain of choices, each reasonable in isolation, each irreversible. Antarctica did not change because of the Terra Nova expedition. The ice did not soften, the distances did not shrink. The continent remained what it had always been: silent, indifferent, unmoved by effort. The Terra Nova expedition did not end with rescue. It ended with discovery, with words written in fading ink, with a tent buried in snow, and with the quiet understanding that preparation, belief, and discipline are not the same as adaptability. The men did not fail to try, they failed to turn back, and Antarctica does not allow second chances. Thank you for watching until the end. If this story stayed with you, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. Every expedition leaves behind questions, and different perspectives matter. If you'd like to continue exploring real journeys where ambition met the limits of human endurance, consider subscribing to the channel. More stories are waiting, and the ice keeps its records.